Trey Morgan rode into Copper Ridge, carrying nothing but a sheriff's badge and the ghosts of 33 dead miners. The town had buried its secrets deep, but bullets don't respect unmarked graves. He came looking for justice. What he found was a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the railroad itself, and the only woman who could prove it was about to disappear forever. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The autumn sky hung low over Copper Ridge, pressing down like a coffin lid. Trey Morgan sat on the wooden bench outside the marshal's office, watching the town move through its daily rituals with the mindless devotion of men who'd already given up on living. The mine, that great mouth of stone and darkness that had swallowed the town's hope, had stopped speaking 3 weeks ago. No more rumbling echoes, no more calls for rescue, just the hollow silence of a grave waiting to be filled. He'd come to Copper Ridge because of that silence. The telegram had arrived in Denver on a Tuesday, soiled with dust and urgent with desperation. 33 miners dead in a collapse. Standard accident. Coroner's report filed. Case closed. But Trey had worked long enough in this territory to know that when deaths came in convenient numbers and closed cases smelled of corruption, there was usually blood beneath the surface. Blood that someone had paid good money to bury. Trey was 46 years old, weathered by 40 years of frontier life. His face carried the map of every town he'd passed through, every corpse he'd examined, every lie he'd been forced to swallow in the name of law. His marshal's badge hung at his chest like an anchor, heavy with the weight of truths he couldn't voice. He'd learned long ago that justice in the West wasn't about truth. It was about power, and power belonged to whoever was willing to hold it longest. Copper Ridge was a town built entirely on illusion. The mine had brought prosperity decades ago, back when silver still flowed from the earth like water. But the silver had run dry years past, leaving behind a husk of a community sustained entirely by railroad contracts and government subsidies. The real money came from moving ore, or so the official records claimed. But Trey had seen the manifest lists, and they didn't add up. The marshal's office was a squat stone building wedged between the saloon and the general store. Inside, papers were stacked high on the desk, forms that had never been properly filed, reports that had been deliberately misfiled, testimony from men who'd since conveniently disappeared. Trey had been sifting through the wreckage for 3 days, and every document he examined told the same story. Someone was moving illegal goods through Copper Ridge, and the town's leadership had sold itself to the highest bidder. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Boots on wooden boards, steady but careful. The kind of careful that came from someone trying not to be noticed. Trey didn't look up. He'd learned to read people from the corners of his vision, to sense intentions in the way bodies moved through space. The woman who sat down beside him on the bench carried herself with the careful balance of someone sitting on the edge of a knife. "You're the marshal from Denver," she said without preamble. Her voice was low, rough-edged, the voice of someone who didn't waste words on courtesy. She was maybe 35, with the sunburned skin of someone who'd spent her life working outdoors. Her dark hair was pulled back severe, and her eyes, gray as river stones, fixed on the horizon like she was searching for something that had long since disappeared. "That depends on whether you're here to help or here to warn me away," Trey replied, still not looking at her. "Both," she said simply. "My name is Catherine Wells. My husband died in the mine collapse 3 weeks ago." Trey turned to look at her then. Something in her tone, the flatness of it, the absence of emotion, told him this woman had already passed through the first stages of grief and emerged on the other side, hardened and purposeful. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Don't be," Catherine said. Her jaw tightened faintly. Samuel was a good man, but he was also a trusty man. That's what got him killed. Trey leaned back against the bench, studying her. "You think the collapse wasn't an accident?" "I know it wasn't," Catherine said. She lowered her voice further, glancing around to ensure no one was watching them from the windows of the nearby buildings. Samuel kept notes about the mine's condition. He was a surveyor, meticulous, careful. He documented everything. 2 weeks before the collapse, he told me the mine was compromised, that there were structural issues that needed to be addressed immediately. He was going to take his concerns to the superintendent. And, Trey prompted, and he never made it to the superintendent, Catherine said, her voice tightening. That night, came home terrified, said he'd been warned, said someone had told him that if he opened his mouth about what he'd seen, there would be consequences. For him, for me, for anyone who mattered to him. Trey felt something cold settle in his chest. This was bigger than he'd initially thought. This wasn't just corruption. This was deliberate murder dressed up as accident. Do you know who warned him? Catherine shook her head slowly. I don't know the name, but Samuel described him as a real man, someone with authority, someone with reach beyond Copper Ridge, someone with enough power to make men disappear. The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Trey and Catherine separated by a careful distance, the unspoken agreement of two people who understood the dangers of appearing too conspiratorial. A man rode up to the marshal's office, a man in expensive clothing, his horse groomed to perfection, his bearing suggesting he'd never known physical labor in his life. He dismounted with practiced ease and approached the bench where Trey was now sitting alone. Marshal Morgan, the man said, his voice smooth and polished like oil sliding across water. I'm Aldrich Crane, superintendent of the Copper Ridge mining operation. The town council thought it would be appropriate if I extended our hospitality during your investigation. Trey rose slowly, extending his hand. Appreciate that, Mr. Crane. I have a few questions about the mine collapse. Crane's grip was firm, deliberate, the kind of handshake designed to communicate power and control. Of course, though I suspect you'll find our investigation was thorough and our conclusions sound. It was a tragic accident, a structural failure that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. These things happen in mining operations. The risk is always present. 33 men is more than risk, Trey said. That's negligence. Crane smiled, but it was the smile of a man who'd heard accusations before and found them amusing rather than concerning. We both know how these inquiries tend to go, Marshal. The mining operation has federal contracts. The railroad has interests here. It would be unfortunate if this investigation became prolonged, or if it began pointing fingers at people who've worked hard to build this town's prosperity. The threat hung in the air, obvious and unadorned. Trey studied Crane's face, searching for weakness, for doubt, for any crack in the superintendent's confidence. He found none. Crane was too practiced, too certain of his position. This man had faced down lawmen before. This man knew exactly how far he could push before consequences became real. I'll conduct my investigation thoroughly, Trey said carefully. I trust the evidence will speak for itself. The evidence? Crane repeated, nodding slowly. Yes, the evidence is very clear. When you've finished examining it, I'm confident you'll reach the same conclusions we have. Until then, please enjoy the town's hospitality. Crane rode away, and Trey watched him disappear down the main street toward the mine entrance. When he turned back to look for Catherine Wells, he found her gone. But in her place, wedged beneath a loose board on the bench, was a sealed envelope. Inside, written in careful script, were the words, "The documents you're looking for are hidden at my house. Come after midnight. Tell no one." Below it was an address. Trey tucked the envelope into his coat pocket, his mind racing through the implications. This was the moment where investigations either died or transformed into something dangerous. He'd reached the point of no return. Everything that happened next would lead either to the truth or to a convenient accident that would explain the marshal's death. The sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky red, the color of rust, the color of dried blood, the color of warnings going unheeded. Trey returned to his room at the boarding house and waited for darkness to come, knowing that when it did, everything would change. The moon was 3/4 full, casting silver light across the rutted streets of Copper Ridge. Trey moved carefully through the darkness, following the address Catherine had given him. Her house was on the edge of town, a modest structure built with working-class integrity, but lacking any pretense toward comfort or elegance. He approached from the rear, staying to the shadows, his revolver loose in its holster. The back door was unlocked, exactly as Catherine had specified in the second letter he'd found, slipped under his door at the boarding house while he'd been eating supper. She was waiting in the kitchen, a single candle burning low on the table, its light casting her face into a mask of shadows and illumination. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I've been watching you since you arrived. I needed to be certain you were genuinely investigating and not simply going through the motions for the railroad." "How can you be sure?" Trey asked. Catherine smiled faintly. "I can't, but Samuel taught me to recognize men of conscience. He said they wore their burden in a particular way, in the shoulders and the eyes. I see that in you." She led him to a small room off the main living space. The walls were lined with papers, maps, mine surveys, financial records, correspondence. It was a substantial archive of documentation, compiled with obvious care over a considerable period of time. "Samuel started collecting these documents 5 years ago," Catherine explained, moving to a particular stack. "He began noticing discrepancies in the official mine records, or quantities that didn't match the refined amounts. Shipment manifests that didn't align with the quantities shown in the superintendent's reports. At first, he thought they were simply clerical errors, but when he started investigating further, he discovered something much worse." She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Samuel's careful handwriting. "The railroad isn't just moving ore from the mine," Catherine continued. "It's moving other cargo, weapons." Samuel documented the shipments, recorded their destinations. The railroad has been smuggling military weapons westward, to Apache tribes, to Mexican cartels, to anyone willing to pay. The mine operation is cover for an illegal weapons trafficking enterprise. Trey felt the weight of this knowledge settle over him like a shroud. This wasn't simple corruption. This wasn't about embezzlement or bribery. This was organized crime on a massive scale, operating with federal backing, using the apparatus of legitimate commerce as camouflage. The men who organized something like this weren't town officials or railway superintendents. They were powerful men with reach that extended far beyond the territories. Samuel was going to go to the federal authorities, Catherine said. He compiled everything. The manifests, the records, correspondence. He had enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. But before he could leave Copper Ridge, someone warned him off. Someone told him that if he spoke, he'd die. And if he tried to run, everyone he cared about would die first. So he stayed silent, Trey said, and died in the mine collapse. "Samuel didn't die in a collapse," Catherine said, her voice hardening. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression remained fierce, unrelenting. "He died because he went to the mine that morning and discovered something he wasn't supposed to discover. Someone was waiting for him in the tunnels. Someone guaranteed the structural failure would happen at precisely the moment when Samuel Wells would be working in the section that collapsed." She pulled out another document, a mining schedule written in an unfamiliar hand. This was found near Samuel's body. It's a work rotation that differs significantly from the official schedule. Samuel had been assigned to a specific tunnel section, assigned by Aldrich Crane personally. The tunnel that collapsed. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Trey examined the documents with the methodical care of a man who understood that evidence could be destroyed, distorted, or disposed of with frightening ease. Everything Catherine was showing him could disappear within hours if the wrong people discovered it had been preserved. "These documents are dangerous," Trey said. "Possessing them puts you at risk." "I'm already at risk," Catherine said. "They've taken my husband. If I don't act, they'll simply wait until I become irrelevant, then dispose of me as casually as they disposed of Samuel. There's no safety in silence. There's only the slow death of allowing evil to continue unopposed." She moved to a wooden box hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. Inside were more documents, federal correspondence, shipping manifests, financial records showing payments made to various railroad officials. "This is everything Samuel collected," Catherine said. "It's evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into Denver, into Washington itself. But it's also evidence that no law enforcement agency in this territory can be trusted. The railroad has too many connections, too many people on its payroll." "Then why tell me?" Trey asked. "Why show me any of this?" Catherine looked at him steadily. "Because Samuel believed there were still good men in this world. Men who wouldn't compromise their principles for money or power. He talked about you, Marshal Morgan. Said he'd read about your investigations, about cases where you stood against powerful people even when it would have been easier to look away. He believed you were the kind of man who might actually do something with this information." Before Trey could respond, there was a sound from outside. Horses approaching, voices calling out. Catherine's face went white. She moved to the window and peered out cautiously. In the moonlight, Trey could see 3 riders approaching the house, their movements purposeful and coordinated. They weren't searching or investigating. They knew exactly where they were going. "We need to leave," Catherine said urgently. "The back entrance, quickly into the desert. There's a canyon about a mile north, if we can reach it." "Go," Trey said, moving toward the front door. "Take those documents. Hide them somewhere the railroad will never find them. I'll buy you time." "You'll be killed," Catherine said. "Probably," Trey acknowledged. "But if those documents disappear, 33 men died for nothing. Their families get no answers, no justice, no closure. That's not acceptable." Catherine hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. She gathered the documents into a leather case. Moving with the urgency of someone who understood, she was being offered her only chance at survival. She fled toward the back of the house as Trey stepped out onto the front porch, his hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. The 3 riders dismounted with practiced ease, their faces obscured by the darkness, but their intentions unmistakable. The leader, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, stepped forward. "Marshal Morgan," he said, "I'm afraid your investigation has run its course. The railroad has decided to close the inquiry into the mine collapse. You'll be leaving Copper Ridge at first light, and you'll be taking nothing of evidentiary value with you." "And if I refuse?" Trey asked calmly, his hand drifting slowly toward his revolver. The man smiled. "Then you'll become part of the accident. Just another death that happens to inconvenience people who should have known better than to ask questions. The town will mourn you for 3 days. Then it will move on." "The railroad has done this before," Trey observed. "It wasn't a question. Many times," the man confirmed. "We've built an entire industry on the principle that inconvenient truths can be eliminated as easily as inconvenient people. You're not the first federal marshal to arrive in a town where the railroad has interests. You won't be the last." Trey's hand closed around the grip of his revolver. Behind him, he could hear Catherine's footsteps fading into the desert darkness. If he could hold these men's attention for just another minute or two, she'd have enough of a head start to reach the canyon. "You're making a mistake," Trey said, his voice steady. "If you kill me, if it looks like murder, territorial authorities will come looking for answers, and answers have a way of attracting attention you don't want." "We're not going to kill you," the man said. He gestured to his companions, and they approached Trey from either side. "You're going to ride out of Copper Ridge tonight, right now. You're going to file a report saying the mine collapse was exactly what it appeared to be, an unfortunate accident. You're going to recommend against any further investigation. And then you're going to forget that this town, this mine, or Catherine Wells ever existed. If you do these things, you'll live to see another sunrise. If you don't." "The woman is gone," Trey said. "You can beat me, threaten me, kill me, but she has the documents, and she'll ensure they reach the right people." The man's expression hardened. He gestured sharply to one of his companions. "Find her. Now." Catherine ran through the desert with the desperate focus of someone who understood that her life depended on surviving the next few hours. The documents were heavy in the leather case, strapped across her chest, the weight both burden and purpose. Behind her, she could hear the sound of horses and men's voices calling out as the search expanded into the night. The canyon Trey had mentioned, the one she'd referenced in her desperate plea, was real enough in her mind, though she wasn't entirely certain it existed in physical reality. Samuel had mentioned it once, years ago, when he'd been surveying the land around Copper Ridge, a place where the earth split open, where water ran year-round, where a person could hide and survive indefinitely if they were clever and careful. She didn't have a horse. She'd left everything except the documents, moving on foot through the sagebrush and rocks that cut at her legs and drew blood from her skin. Her lungs burned with effort, her heart pounding against her ribs with the force of a captive creature trying to escape from a cage. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, casting sharp shadows across the landscape that made every stone look like an obstacle and every shadow look like a threat. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, more organized. She could hear the railroad men coordinating, their shouts growing closer as they moved deeper into the desert. Catherine veered toward what she hoped was north, toward where Samuel had mentioned the canyon would be. The documents bounced against her chest, their corners pressing into her ribs with every desperate stride. She had to escape. She had to survive. She had to deliver Samuel's testimony to people who would understand its significance and take action. But the desert was vast, and pursuit was relentless. One of the railroad men had faster horses than she had legs. She could hear him closing in, his horse's hooves thundering across the rocky terrain. Catherine looked around desperately for something, anything, that might provide cover or advantage. That was when she saw it. A line of darkness cutting across the desert floor, the unmistakable shadow of a canyon's edge. Without thinking, without calculating whether the drop would kill her or merely injure her, Catherine ran toward that darkness and threw herself over the edge. She fell through 10 feet of empty space, landing hard on sand and loose stone. Pain exploded through her left ankle, but adrenaline and fear overwhelmed the sensation. She scrambled backward into the shadows of the canyon as the railroad man on horseback reined up at the edge, his silhouette stark against the moonlight. "You can't hide forever," he called down into the darkness. "The railroad owns every law enforcement office in this territory. Every trail out leads back to us. You're trapped." Catherine didn't respond. She moved deeper into the canyon, following the sound of running water, understanding that water meant life and life meant options. Her ankle throbbed with pain, probably broken, possibly just severely sprained, but she pushed the sensation into the background and focused on survival. Behind her, a railroad man dismounted. She could hear him sliding down the canyon wall, his boots scraping against stone, his breathing heavy with exertion and determination. She was being hunted, tracked, driven deeper into the desert like an animal fleeing from a predator that had infinitely more resources and patience than she did. Catherine waded into the stream, using the flowing water as a way to disguise her trail. The canyon walls towered around her, creating a maze of darkness and shadow that was both beautiful and terrifying. She understood now what Samuel must have felt in those moments before his death, the knowledge that powerful forces were arrayed against her, that escape might be impossible, that the world was far more cruel and systemic in its injustice than she'd ever wanted to believe. But she also understood something else. The documents were still with her. Samuel's testimony was still intact. Even if she died in this canyon, even if the railroad men found her and killed her, the evidence of their crimes would survive her death. Someone would eventually find the documents. Someone would eventually demand answers. Catherine climbed out of the stream and pressed herself into a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, making herself as small and invisible as possible. Below, the railroad man was still searching, still calling out threats and promises of mercy if she surrendered. She held her breath, listening to his footsteps grow closer and then, mercifully, pass by her hiding place. Hours passed in that crevice, hours that felt like days. Hours during which Catherine's ankle swelled and her body began to shake with shock and cold. But she survived. When dawn broke across the desert sky, turning the stone walls of the canyon gold and orange. She was still alive. The railroad men had either abandoned the search or moved on to look elsewhere. Catherine emerged from her hiding place slowly, carefully, examining the landscape to ensure she was truly alone. The sky above the canyon was beginning to lighten, the stars fading as genuine sunrise approached. She had survived the night. She had survived the pursuit. But she was also trapped in a remote canyon with a severely injured ankle, limited water, and no clear way out. She had survived long enough to understand her victory was temporary, a brief reprieve before circumstances reasserted themselves and claimed whatever remained of her dwindling resources and hope. Trey Morgan woke in the holding cell of the Copper Ridge Marshal's office with a mouthful of blood and the certain knowledge that he'd been thoroughly and systematically beaten by men who understood the value of violence without permanent disfigurement. His ribs were wrapped. His left eye was swollen nearly shut, but he was alive, which meant they still needed him for something. The door to the holding cell opened, and Aldrich Crane walked in with the casual confidence of a man who'd never experienced consequences for his actions. He carried a chair with him, which he positioned outside the cell bars before sitting down to regard his prisoner. "You're a persistent man, Marshal Morgan," Crane began, his tone conversational. "It's a quality I typically admire, but persistence coupled with naivety is a dangerous combination in our modern age." "Where is Catherine Wells?" Trey asked, his voice rough from the beating. "Dead," Crane said simply. "She ran into the desert last night, injured her ankle in the canyon, and died of exposure and thirst. We found her body this morning. Quite tragic, really. She was a remarkable woman, clever, determined, but ultimately no match for the realities of frontier life." Trey felt something cold settle in his chest. He wanted to believe Crane was lying, that Catherine had somehow survived and escaped, but he'd learned long ago not to allow hope to override experience. Crane had no reason to lie. If Catherine was dead, it was because she was dead. "You're going to leave Copper Ridge," Crane continued. "You're going to file a report indicating that the mine collapse was an unfortunate but unavoidable accident. No wrongdoing, no negligence, no criminal activity. You're going to do this because your alternative is execution disguised as accident. And you're going to do this because Catherine Wells' documents are now in our possession. We recovered them from her body." Trey looked up sharply at this. Catherine's documents, the physical evidence of the railroad's crimes, were gone. Everything that Samuel Wells had risked his life to gather, everything that Catherine had died to preserve, was now in the hands of the people responsible for the conspiracy. "The railroad," Trey said quietly, "operates with federal backing, which means someone in Washington is involved in this conspiracy, which means this reaches higher than you, Crane. Eventually, someone will investigate. Eventually, the truth will come out." Crane smiled, and it was the smile of a man confident in the righteousness and inevitability of his position. "Perhaps, but by then, we'll have spent decades extracting enormous profits from our weapons trafficking operation. By then, we'll have established enough financial and political power that investigation becomes impossible, exposure becomes irrelevant. Truth, Marshal Morgan, is a luxury that belongs only to the powerful. The weak must content themselves with survival." Trey was released the following morning with explicit instructions. Leave town, file the report, speak to no one about what he'd discovered. The railroad had arranged for a fresh horse, supplies, and a destination. Copper Ridge didn't want him dead if it could be avoided. Death would raise questions. Investigation would create complications. They preferred he simply go away, taking his knowledge and conscience with him into obscurity. But Trey Morgan had learned something important in the hours he'd spent in that cell contemplating his own mortality. The railroad could control law enforcement offices, manipulate courts, even arrange accidents that looked like natural deaths. But they couldn't control the human conscience, couldn't silence the voice inside a man that whispered about right and wrong, could not kill the stubborn insistence on justice that refused to be extinguished despite all evidence that justice was impossible. He rode out of Copper Ridge with his head down and his heart hardened, but his mind was already working on the problem of how to expose truth. when all official channels were compromised, all official authorities were complicit. 3 months later, Trey Morgan stood in the federal building in Denver, confronting a room full of men who represented every level of corruption and complicity the railroad's conspiracy had purchased. But he wasn't alone. Catherine Wells was alive, injured but alive, having survived the desert through sheer will and luck and the discovery of a Spanish missionary outpost hidden deep in the canyon system. More importantly, she had kept copies of the documents. Samuel Wells had been meticulous in his record-keeping, and Catherine had been meticulous in her reading of those records. Every manifest had been copied. Every financial transaction had been documented. Every piece of evidence had been duplicated and hidden in locations that only Catherine knew, ensuring that no single discovery could eliminate the entire archive. The men in the room, federal inspectors, railroad executives, territorial authorities, had underestimated Catherine Wells. They'd assumed that a woman, especially one grieving and traumatized, would simply accept the narrative of accident and death that had been constructed for her. They hadn't anticipated her survival. They hadn't anticipated her resilience. "The evidence is incontrovertible," Trey said, spreading the documents across the table in the federal building. "The railroad has been operating an illegal weapons trafficking enterprise for at least a decade. The mine operation in Copper Ridge serves as cover. 33 men were murdered deliberately, systematically, to cover up this operation. Samuel Wells died because he threatened to expose the conspiracy. Catherine Wells nearly died in pursuit of justice. And your organization, your department, your entire authority structure has been complicit in this conspiracy through either active participation or willful negligence." One of the federal inspectors, a man named Harrison who occupied an office high enough that he could plausibly claim ignorance of the conspiracy, cleared his throat. "The implications of what you're suggesting are enormous," he said carefully, "if what you're claiming is true." "It's not a matter of if," Catherine interrupted. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had survived the desert and emerged transformed by the experience. "It's a matter of evidence. You can read the documents yourselves. You can verify the transactions. You can investigate the deaths. Or you can bury this entire inquiry and watch your credibility evaporate when the truth eventually emerges." "The railroad is powerful," one of the executives said. "More powerful than you understand. Exposing this conspiracy would create enormous complications." "Those complications are my problem," Trey said flatly. "Your jobs are to enforce the law, to protect the citizens of this territory. If you fail to do that, you're complicit in murder and conspiracy, in every crime the railroad commits going forward. That's the choice you're making right now, whether to do your duty or protect your careers." The room fell silent. Outside, Denver moved through its daily business, unaware that the machinery of justice was grinding slowly toward a verdict in a federal building, unaware that truth was being weighed against power, and the outcome was still uncertain. Eventually, the federal inspectors made the decision to investigate. It wasn't a decision born from moral clarity or a commitment to justice. It was a decision born from fear. Fear of exposure, fear of scandal, fear of the professional consequences that would accompany complicity if the story emerged through channels they hadn't controlled. The investigation took months, then years. It expanded from Copper Ridge to the entire railroad operation, uncovering layers of corruption, conspiracy, and systematic abuse that reached far higher than anyone had initially suspected. 47 people were eventually indicted. 12 were convicted. The railroad's weapons trafficking operation was dismantled, but Samuel Wells remained dead. The 33 miners remained entombed beneath the rubble of the collapsed tunnel. Catherine Wells bore the scars of her time in the desert for the rest of her life. Physical scars that healed, emotional scars that never quite faded. And Trey Morgan returned to his position as federal marshal, understanding that justice in the West was a fragile thing, achieved only through extraordinary effort and often costing more than any reasonable person should be expected to pay. He carried the knowledge that there were still good men in positions of authority, but they were far outnumbered by the compromised, the complicit, and the actively corrupt. He carried the knowledge that speaking truth to power in the American West was not a path to safety or reward, but a path that might lead to redemption, if a man was lucky, and if he survived long enough to reach it. 5 years after the investigation into the railroad conspiracy concluded, Copper Ridge was a different town, changed not by prosperity or growth, but by the painful process of reckoning with its own complicity and shame. The mine had been sealed. The railroad's operations had been restructured under federal oversight. The superintendent's office had been dismantled and converted into a memorial for the 33 miners who died in the collapse. Trey Morgan stood in that memorial on a gray morning in October, studying the names carved into the stone wall. 33 names. 33 men who'd had families, hopes, futures that had been stolen from them by men whose crimes were so carefully insulated by money and power that it had taken extraordinary effort to expose them. Catherine Wells stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the stone. She'd returned to Copper Ridge to work as a schoolteacher, dedicating herself to ensuring that the next generation understood the importance of speaking truth and bearing witness to injustice, even when speaking truth was dangerous and bearing witness came at considerable personal cost. Samuel's name should be on this wall, she said quietly. He died as much for exposing this conspiracy as anyone who died in the collapse, but the inscription only lists the miners. His name is on the wall that matters, Trey said. The federal report, the court records, every document that established what really happened, what really was being hidden. That's where Samuel's legacy lives, in the truth that required his testimony to exist. Catherine nodded, though her expression remained heavy with the weight of loss and the knowledge of ongoing injustice. There are 30 other towns in this territory alone where similar conspiracies are probably operating, she said. 30 places where people are dying to protect profit, where truth is being buried as deliberately and carefully as bodies in unmarked graves. What do you do about that? Trey considered the question. The truth was that most of those conspiracies would never be exposed. Most of the corruption would persist and metastasize and grow stronger with each passing year. Most of the people who bore witness to injustice would choose silence over the terrible cost of speaking. But not all of them. Sometimes a person like Catherine Wells emerged from the desert changed, hardened, committed to ensuring that at least some of the truth survived. Sometimes a person like Trey Morgan refused to accept official narratives and pursued the harder, more costly path of investigation and exposure. I do what I can, Trey said finally. I listen to the Catherine Welleses of the world. I investigate the inconsistencies that don't quite add up. I refuse to accept convenient explanations for deaths that shouldn't have happened. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's what separates men from the corruption that seeks to consume them. Catherine smiled faintly. Samuel said something similar the last time I saw him alive. He said that doing what you could, even when it wasn't enough, was the only way to maintain the part of your soul that was worth keeping. I didn't understand it then. The desert taught me to understand it. They stood together in silence, studying the wall of names. Outside, the wind carried dust across Copper Ridge, dust that contained the echoes of 33 men, the sacrifice of Samuel Wells, the struggle of Catherine and Trey to force truth, to coexist with power. The dust never completely settled. In the American West, dust never did. But sometimes, when the light hit it just right, you could see through the haze to the reality beneath. Not a reality of inevitable justice, but a reality where truth persisted despite the forces arrayed against it, where courage had meaning even when it didn't guarantee victory, where the cost of silence was greater than the cost of speaking, even if speaking cost everything. That was the legacy of Copper Ridge. That was the story carried by the dust and the stone and the water that ran through the canyons and the people who'd survived to bear witness to what really happened when power tried to hide its crimes beneath convenient lies. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.